For 95% of human history, if someone tried to tell everyone else what to do, they were mocked, exiled, or struck down on the spot. Our ancestors were fiercely, aggressively egalitarian. There were no chiefs, no masters, no crowns. And yet, seemingly out of nowhere, millions of people agreed to fall to their knees before a single mortal, calling them a living god who owned the very dirt beneath their feet. Humans didn't simply stumble into kings by accident. We walked into an evolutionary trap that made monarchy inevitable, a trap laid not by bloodthirsty conquerors, but by a quiet shift in how we stored our food. And once the door shut behind us, there was no going back. To understand how kings were invented, we first have to look at the world before them. For roughly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in nomadic bands. These groups rarely exceeded 30 to 50 individuals. In a group that small, anonymity was impossible. Everyone knew who pulled their weight, who shared their food, and who cheated. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm calls this society a reverse dominance hierarchy. In chimpanzee troops, the strongest, most violent alpha male rules through terror. Early humans completely flipped that biological script. They realized that 3 mediocre hunters with spears could easily kill 1 giant bully. Equality wasn't a philosophical luxury. It was a strictly enforced survival tactic. If a skilled hunter returned with an enormous antelope and began bragging, the tribe didn't celebrate him or crown him leader. Instead, they subjected him to merciless, systematic mockery. They would insult the size of the meat, call it skinny, and joke about his clumsiness. The Kalahari Jew/Huansi people famously called this cooling the hunter's heart. They knew that pride was the seed of arrogance, and arrogance was the seed of tyranny. If mockery failed to humble an ambitious individual, the tribe escalated. The next step was ostracism, refusing to speak to him, share fire, or hunt together. In the Pleistocene wild, complete social isolation was a death sentence. And if someone still refused to accept group consensus and tried to rule by force, the band would quietly agree to execute them in their sleep. Dominance was brutally suppressed by a coalition of the equal. Furthermore, hunter-gatherer mobility made physical wealth accumulation impossible. You could only own what you could literally carry on your back. Hoarding extra meat was pointless because it spoiled within 48 hours. The only rational way to store surplus food was in other people's stomachs. By giving your extra meat to your neighbor today, you guaranteed they would feed you tomorrow. Reputation and social goodwill were the only meaningful currencies. Crucially, hunter-gatherers had the ultimate escape mechanism from bad leaders. If an elder became unreasonably bossy, dissatisfied members simply walked away. They packed their leather bags, grabbed their children, and joined a neighboring clan. Anthropologists call this fundamental freedom voting with your feet. You cannot enslave a population that can vanish into the forest overnight. For over 90% of our species' existence, hierarchy was structurally impossible. Human beings were biologically wired for freedom, mobility, and fierce autonomy. No one paid taxes, no one built palaces for strangers, no one bowed. So what shattered this 200,000-year balance? What could possibly convince proud, independent humans to surrender their freedom? The answer was not a charismatic conqueror with a massive army. The catalyst was a microscopic grass seed that completely rewrote our relationship with Earth. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet began to warm as the Ice Age ended. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, wild wheat and barley grew in dense stands. Humans discovered they could harvest enough grain in 3 weeks to feed a clan for a year. It felt like a miracle, a permanent escape from the anxieties of hunting. People built heavy stone grinding mortars and permanent wooden huts. They stopped wandering. They settled down beside the fertile riverbanks. They thought they had conquered nature and secured eternal abundance. In reality, they had just stepped into the most elegant trap ever devised. A trap made of mud brick walls, immovable property, and rotting grain. And behind those granary walls, the first seeds of kingship were already beginning to sprout. When humans switched to agriculture, their physical biology and geography changed overnight. As political scientist James C. Scott points out, grain has unique physical properties. Cassava and potatoes grow underground and can be hidden or harvested whenever you want. If an armed bully arrives at your potato patch, you can leave the potatoes in the ground for months. Grain, however, is completely different. Grain is visible above ground, ripens all at once, and is easily counted. Grain is the only food crop that is perfectly suited for state taxation. It can be harvested simultaneously, measured in standard clay jars, and stored for decades. More importantly, grain created the world's first immovable, highly concentrated wealth. In a hunter-gatherer band, if you tried to steal someone's property, there was almost nothing to take. In an agricultural village, a single granary contained enough food to feed hundreds of people for an entire year. For the first time in history, there was something enormous, stationary, and valuable enough to steal. And this completely destroyed the fundamental human freedom, the ability to walk away. Consider what it took to establish an early farm. You had to spend years clearing thick forests, breaking rocky soil, and digging canals with wooden sticks. You built thick mud brick houses, heavy clay ovens, and underground storage pits. All of your life's labor and the survival of your children was invested in that single square kilometer of dirt. If an arrogant, aggressive individual seized control of the village granary, you could no longer simply vote with your feet and walk away into the wilderness. Leaving meant abandoning your crops, your house, your water source, and your stored calories. Leaving meant almost certain death in the wild, or being enslaved by a neighboring settlement. Humans had built a cage of their own making, and the bars were made of wheat. They were physically anchored to the soil, and once a population is trapped in one place, they become governable. They can be counted. They can be monitored. They can be forced to pay. Furthermore, agriculture triggered an unprecedented population explosion. Hunter-gatherer mothers had to carry their infants while constantly walking, which naturally limited childbirth to once every 4 or 5 years. Sedentary farmers living in permanent houses had access to soft-grain porridge. They could wean babies earlier, and birth rates skyrocketed to 1 child every 2 years. Within a few centuries, small kinship villages swelled into chaotic towns of thousands, and this created a brand new social crisis: the breakdown of trust. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar established that humans can comfortably maintain around 150 stable relationships. When a settlement exceeds a few hundred people, you no longer know everyone personally. You don't know who stole a sheep, who polluted the canal, or who broke a contract. The old egalitarian mechanisms of teasing, gossip, and collective peer pressure completely failed. You cannot shame someone into honesty if you don't even know their name. Disputes over land boundaries and irrigation rights began escalating into violent clan feuds. If Clan A killed a member of Clan B retaliated by burning Clan A's fields. Without an overarching authority, large agricultural settlements inevitably tore themselves apart. People desperately needed a third party, an impartial judge with the power to enforce peace. They were willing to give up a fraction of their freedom just to stop the endless bloodshed. And into this vacuum of chaos stepped a very specific kind of personality. Not a tyrant with an iron fist, but a smooth organizer who solved problems. Someone who organized the digging of communal ditches and mediated land disputes. Anthropologists call these pioneering figures the big men. They were respected. They were beloved. They were indispensable. And they discovered that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a spear, but a gift that could never be repaid. Through the subtle magic of unpayable social debt, the voluntary egalitarian society began to calcify into a hereditary aristocracy. The first step toward the throne was not violence. It was pure, overwhelming generosity, a generosity that quietly put a golden leash around the neck of every villager. And when the famine came, that leash was yanked tight. The era of the egalitarian hunter was officially dead. To understand how a generous community leader transforms into an untouchable king, we have to examine the hidden economic engine of early human societies. In traditional societies across Melanesia and ancient North America, anthropologists observed a phenomenon known as competitive feasting or potlatch. An aspiring big man didn't hoard wealth in secret like a modern billionaire. Hoarding in plain sight would only invite the old instincts of mockery and violent rebalancing. Instead, the big man did something counterintuitive. He gave everything away in public. He would spend years coordinating his extended family to cultivate extra fields, raise hundreds of pigs, and weave elaborate ceremonial textiles. Then he invited rival clans from miles around to an obscene, multi-day spectacle of consumption. Piles of food were devoured, ceremonial gifts were distributed, and wealth was openly destroyed. Why would anyone do this? What was the evolutionary payoff of deliberate bankruptcy? The answer lies in the deep human wiring of reciprocity. French sociologist Marcel Mauss proved that in gift-based economies, there is no such thing as a free gift. Every gift demands an equal or greater counter-gift at a future date. If you receive an enormous gift and cannot repay it in physical goods, the social contract forces you to repay it with something far more valuable: your status. You repay with political support during village council meetings. You repay by offering your sons to help harvest the big man's fields for free. You repay by fighting alongside his clan when violent border disputes erupt. The big man had discovered how to convert perishable calories into permanent social power. Food rots in a few months, but social debt can last for decades. Now consider what happened during a catastrophic regional drought. Average farming families who produced just enough to survive ran out of food within weeks. Their children were crying, their seed grain was eaten, and desperation set in. The big man's family, however, possessed vast reserve granaries built from decades of surplus. The starving farmers walked up to the big man's gate with outstretched, trembling hands. The big man didn't turn them away. He opened the doors and handed out bread. He saved their lives. He was celebrated as a merciful savior. But that grain was not a gift anymore. It was a mortgage on their freedom. To survive, the farmers pledged their land, their labor, and the labor of their future descendants. The independent freeholders of the Neolithic were quietly transformed into tenant serfs. And when the big man died, something profound and dangerous happened. In the old hunter-gatherer days, prestige was personal and died with the individual. You couldn't inherit a hunter's legendary eyesight or an elder's wisdom. But you could inherit 500 acres of prime irrigated farmland. You could inherit 3 massive granaries packed with thousands of bushels of barley. And you could inherit the ledger of debts owed by hundreds of desperate families. The big man's son did not need to be charismatic, generous, or wise. He was born into institutional wealth. The voluntary authority of the father solidified into the hereditary entitlement of the son. A permanent aristocratic class had officially decoupled itself from the laboring masses. The rich no longer worked the soil. They managed the people who worked the soil. Yet even this hereditary aristocracy had a dangerous vulnerability. What was stopping 10,000 angry exploited farmers from rising up with pitchforks, smashing the granary doors and burning the debt tablets to ashes? In the early stages, the elites had no standing army. They were vastly outnumbered. To survive, the emerging ruling class needed 2 final, devastating inventions. They needed professional, organized violence to smash rebellions with terrifying efficiency. And they needed a cosmic mythology that convinced the peasants that rebellion was a sin against the universe itself. The age of voluntary debt was about to be baptized in bronze and blood. The peaceful big man was about to evolve into the terrifying, merciless warlord. And the stage for this bloody transformation was set in the scorching plains of Mesopotamia, where water was life, and cities were preparing to butcher each other for the right to drink. The peaceful world of voluntary cooperation was about to end forever. By 5,000 years ago, the river valleys of Sumer were the most densely populated places on Earth. Dozens of independent city-states like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash were packed tightly together. And between these cities lay a limited supply of fertile, irrigated agricultural land. When a drought struck or a river shifted its course, the consequences were catastrophic. One city's upstream canal diversion meant immediate, agonizing starvation for the city downstream. Desperation replaced diplomacy. Armed raiding parties began marching across the desert to sack neighboring granaries. They slaughtered the men, enslaved the women, burned the houses, and carried off the grain. Suddenly, every human being inside a city faced a terrifying existential threat. In a state of total war, the old Council of Elders was dangerously useless. You cannot vote, debate, and reach peaceful consensus while enemy battering rams are at the gate. A city under siege needs one voice, one supreme commander, and absolute, instant obedience. In the Sumerian language, this temporary wartime dictator was called the Lugal. The word Lu meant man and Gal meant great, literally, the big man. The city council approached the most capable general and made a desperate bargain. Take complete command of our grain, our walls, our sons, and our lives. Defeat the enemy at our gates and save our civilization from total extermination. The bargain worked. The Lugal rallied the army, built massive defensive brick walls, and crushed the invading enemies in brutal, decisive open-field slaughter. The city was saved. The granaries were full again. The citizens celebrated in the streets. Then, the city council gathered and politely asked the Lugal to step down, disband his army, and return to his life as an ordinary private citizen. And the Lugal looked down at them from his war chariot, smiled, and said, "No." Why on earth would he step down? He commanded 500 battle-hardened veterans whose loyalty belonged to him alone. He held the keys to the city gates. He controlled the central armory, and the threat of external war never truly vanished. The Lugal told the terrified population, "If I disband my army, the invaders will return next month and murder your children. If you want permanent safety, you must give me permanent power." This was the classic protection racket, the foundation of the early state. The state claimed a monopoly on violence. In exchange for protecting citizens from outside violence, the king demanded absolute obedience and the right to extract wealth at will. Tribute was no longer voluntary, it was institutionalized taxation. If you refused to surrender 30% of your harvest, the king's soldiers didn't negotiate. They dragged you to the town square and beat you publicly. Violence had been organized, centralized, and legalized under the crown. The warrior was no longer a defender of the tribe. He was the owner of the city. He took the largest estate, the best irrigation canals, and the finest herds. He appointed his sons as army commanders and his daughters as high priestesses. Dynastic monarchy was officially born. Yet, the Lugal faced a dangerous mathematical dilemma. Even with 500 elite bodyguards, he ruled over 50,000 resentful subjects. Brute physical force is expensive, exhausting, and fragile. Soldiers demand constant grain rations, gold pay, and bronze equipment. If the harvest failed, and the king couldn't feed his soldiers, his own bodyguards would slit his throat and replace him before breakfast. To survive for more than a single generation, the king had to conquer something far deeper and more durable than the physical body. He had to conquer the human imagination. He had to convince the common people that obeying the king was not just convenient. It was the fundamental, unchanging law of the entire universe. Together they concocted the most magnificent lie ever told. And for this, he turned to the oldest, most powerful class in history, the priests. Spirits inhabited trees, rivers, and animals. Everything was alive and interconnected. No single spirit ruled the cosmos with absolute tyrannical power. The early monarchies completely revolutionized theology to match their political ambitions. The cosmos was reimagined as a giant celestial pyramid. At the apex stood supreme, terrifying gods of storm, sun, and chaos. And who controlled the rainfall? Who kept the sun rising every morning? The priests declared, only the king. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a military leader or a political administrator. He was the physical incarnation of Horus, a living, breathing god walking among mortals. The pharaoh's daily prayers and temple rituals were believed to maintain ma'at, cosmic balance. If the people rebelled against the king, the Nile would refuse to flood, the crops would rot, the sky would collapse, and the entire universe would descend into eternal chaos. Tyranny was no longer framed as human exploitation, it was framed as cosmic maintenance. To question the king's tax rate was to threaten the fabric of reality itself. To cement this psychological stranglehold across vast empires, kings needed a new technology. Around 3200 BCE, in the Sumerian city of Uruk, humans invented writing.